Hello. So, this is the second of three lectures on Marxism. In the first lecture, we looked at Marxism's analysis of class, the emphasis on class analysis and class struggle. And in this lecture, we'll look more precisely at what we mean by capitalism and why socialists such as Marx and Engels believe capitalism needs to be abolished. So, before we discuss socialism, let's consider capitalism. It was, after all, the rise of industrial capitalism in 19th century Europe that brought about socialism as a political movement in opposition to it. Socialism can, in many ways, and especially in its sort of early form, early 19th century form, be seen as the antithesis of capitalism, the opposite of capitalism. So to understand socialism, really we need to understand capitalism. So we're going to start off looking at that, and we're going to look at exactly what are the problems of capitalism according to socialists. Why does it need to be abolished? So to begin with, Marx and Engels never actually used the term capitalism. This is not often appreciated fact. They talked about capital, productive wealth, the means of production, capital, and the reign of capital, the rule of capital. They talked about bourgeois society, which we could think of as kind of capitalist culture. But his followers, however, Marx and Engels' followers did use the term capitalism a great deal. So let's consider what it means. In brief, I would define capitalism as an economic system based on commodity production, that is the production of goods for sale, and private ownership of the means of production. Yep, an economic system based on commodity production and private ownership of the means of production. So that is my preferred definition. It's as simple as that. Many definitions, you sometimes hear definitions talk about capitalism as a market economy or a free market economy, which is fair enough. I don't use that term myself to refer to capitalism for two reasons. Firstly, because markets have existed for millennia before capitalism, so markets can't be associated exclusively with capitalism. And secondly, because markets are never entirely free. They have to be created, maintained, and enforced by the state. So I don't really like the term free market economy. I don't think it's accurate. I think it's a mystification, frankly. And market economy is much too vague. There have been lots of markets before capitalism. So the definition of capitalism I prefer revolves around these 2 points: commodity production and private property, basically, private control of the means of production. So just to explain exactly what this means, it's up to you how much, if you want to take notes in this much depth or not, but just to give you an understanding of what I mean by those two things, commodity production and private ownership of the means of production. So this definition of capitalism that I'm giving you distinguishes it from the earlier economic system of feudalism, which was kind of in the Middle Ages in Europe. So under feudalism, most production was, and in fact for most of human history, most production was subsistence production rather than commodity production. That is to say, goods were produced, mainly food was grown, or clothes made and shoes made and houses built and so on. Goods were produced generally not in the main with the intention of selling it, but with the intention of using them or eating them. Yeah. So generally throughout most of human history before capitalism, certainly in the feudal era, if food was grown, it was grown to be consumed by the grower. Yeah, if a house was built, it was built to be lived in by the builder, and so on. Now, there were markets, as I said. If there was a surplus, if a farmer had a bumper crop one year, then she might sell what she had left over. But the prime aim of her labour was to produce what she needed for her own and her family's subsistence and whatever possibly had to pay in rent and so on. A proportion of the crop was often given to the lord and so on. But the point is, most production was not produced in order to be sold. Most things were grown and produced in order to be used directly, not to be sold particularly. So, and likewise, in feudal times, much of the land was common land. Whilst it might have been owned by a particular landlord, they didn't actually have absolute control over it. And this is important to understand. Lots of people would live on their land of the landlords, as tenants, yeah, kind of renting a little plot, but they would have common rights over that land, including the right to fish and graze cattle and goats and gather firewood and so on. I believe the biggest area of common land left in the country is actually Port Meadow in Oxford, where anyone can, they can keep a horse, they can keep a cow, gather firewood, go fishing and so on. And there were often, before capitalism, there were often laws restricting the sale of land as well. So it's only with capitalism that owners actually gained absolute control over their land. In other words, they gained the right to throw other people off the land, bar other people from using the land, and even to sell it on if they wished. Remember John Locke, when we did liberalism, remember the idea of property rights. This was really what he was talking about, the right to absolute control of one's property, such as land, in order to maximize profit from it. This is something new with capitalism. Yeah, land might have been owned by individuals before, other people had the right to use it. It's with capitalism, precisely, that you get this idea of absolute property rights, the right to bar other people from using certain areas of land, and the right to buy and sell land. Yeah, this is really what the heart, the essence of property rights that John Locke was talking about. So that's what we mean by capitalism, a system of commodity production and private ownership, private control of the means of production. And historically, this system arose first in Europe following the collapse of the feudal system and became dominant between the 15th and 19th centuries. We can say that it became fully entrenched in Britain during the 18th century, really. That is the century that followed from the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And in France, after the French Revolution of 1789, this makes sense from a Marxist point of view, because if you think about it, these revolutions were, in Marxist terms, bourgeois revolutions. So, of course, the bourgeoisie used the political power they gained during those revolutions to establish and entrench the economic system that best suited their interests, that is capitalism. So the socialists of the early 19th century, generally, like Marx and Engels, tended to be what Hayward called fundamentalist socialists. That is, they sought the complete overthrow of capitalism. They didn't want to just reform capitalism, make it a bit fairer. They wanted to overthrow it completely. The complete abolition of private property. Yep. So instead of private ownership of the means of production, they sought an economic system based on collective ownership of property. And instead of commodity production, that is producing goods solely in order to sell them at a profit, they believed goods should be produced on the basis of social need. Yep. So things will be produced not because they can be sold at a profit, but because they are needed by society. So the system they envisaged then was one in which the means of production, remember we mean have in your head when we use this phrase, I'm thinking the land, mines, factories and so on, things that you need to produce, the things you need for mass production to take place. The means of production would be owned collectively by society as a whole rather than by individuals. Yep. So this would also mean and entail the effective abolition of class, if you think about it, because there would no longer be separate classes of owners and non-owners. Remember the three classes we looked at in the last lecture? Aristocracy, ones who own land. Bourgeoisie, ones who own other forms of private property, businesses, industries and so on. And then proletariat, those who own nothing, or more precisely own nothing except their ability to work. So if class is defined by whether or not you own certain private property, if there's no private property to own, then there's no classes. Yeah, there's no different classes. Because in fact, everyone and no one owns property now. Everyone is part of the collective society that collectively owns all of the land, mines, factories, all of the means of production. There's no separate classes. So under socialism, investment decisions would no longer be based on what's most profitable, but rather what would be most useful to society. By the way, I should mention here, socialism believed itself to be the true inheritor of the Enlightenment tradition and of rationalism, Enlightenment rationalism. For socialists, investment according only to profit, as we have under capitalism, produced an irrational society. Let me give you an example. So today, far more investment goes into fossil fuel industries, for example, than renewable energy. Now, given everything we know about climate change, this is completely irrational. Yeah. But this is what happens because fossil fuels are more profitable than renewable energy. And under capitalism, what drives investment and investment decisions, where wealth is invested, people decide that on the basis of what's profitable to invest in, rather than what's socially needed or environmentally essential. The modern pharmaceutical industry, another example. Even though the blueprint for the drugs needed to cure diseases such as malaria, pneumonia, diarrhea are very well known and cost only a few pence each to produce, around 6 million children each year die of such diseases. Yeah, for the lack of a drug that would cost a few pence to produce. That is the same number that died in the Nazi Holocaust, yeah, every single year. Simply because these drugs are not profitable, because the people who need them are too poor to buy them. So instead, the pharmaceutical industry focuses on producing the drugs that rich people want, such as weight loss drugs, or drugs that tackle the diseases more common in rich countries like cancer. So in a capitalist system, industry is privately owned, and only those goods and services are produced which can be sold for a profit. Whereas in a socialist system, industry would be collectively owned, and goods and services would be produced according to social need, what is actually needed by society, what is most needed rather than what's most profitable. So for a socialist, a world in which social needs aren't taken into account at all, actually, I was going to say secondary to private property, but they're not really taken into account in investment decisions at all. That's completely irrational, an irrational system, an irrational economy. So a socialist system is one based on the idea of rational economic planning on the basis of social need, human need. So why do socialists seek such a system? I mean, in a way, by the way I've explained it, you probably have some inkling of the answer to that question. But to go into a bit more detail, according to Andrew Hayward, there are three main reasons why socialists seek the abolition of private property, the abolition of capitalism, and its replacement by collective ownership of property. So, three reasons. First of all, socialists are opposed to private property for moral reasons. Private ownership is unjust, they believe. And this is because wealth is produced collectively and should therefore be owned collectively. Think about a company like Apple, for example. The wealth, Apple, by the way, at the minute are sitting on well over $250 billion of cash reserves, just sitting in the bank. Now, the wealth produced by this company is produced collectively, right, by the software designers, the factory workers who assemble the parts, the miners who dig out the minerals for the electronic chips, the lorry drivers and shipping crews who transport all the items, the dockers who unload it, etc., etc. And yet the vast majority of those involved get none of the profit that they help to produce. So, for example, the 350,000 factory workers in Apple's single giant factory in China, for example, get paid less than £2 an hour, whilst many of the Congolese miners who dig out the coltan, which is the mineral used in the electronic chips, are actually slaves. Many of the Congolese mines are run by paramilitary forces who simply kidnap people, often children, and just force them to dig out coltan at gunpoint without paying them at all. So for a socialist, this is deeply unjust. Why should Apple's shareholders get all the wealth that's produced by these people whilst those actually producing the wealth are exploited so heavily? The second reason socialists believe in the abolition of private property, according to Hayward, is that it is spiritually damaging. In other words, it brings out the worst in people. Encourages the worst aspects of the human spirit. A system which encourages people to enrich themselves at the expense of others breeds acquisitiveness and is morally corrupting. So all the worst elements of human nature, greed, selfishness, aggression, etc., are rewarded in the capitalist system, whilst all the best elements, empathy for one's fellow creatures, altruism, concern for the environment, etc., are punished economically. Let me give you an example by what I mean. Again, going back to Apple, if Apple decided to double the wages of its miners and factory workers, it would immediately see a cut in its profits, which would lead shareholders to sell up their shares and invest elsewhere instead, potentially bringing about the collapse of the company. So for socialists, it's not enough to simply name and shame exploitative companies, because capitalism forces companies to be exploitative in order to maximize profit and therefore attract investment. So this is why a change of the whole economic system is necessary. This is why abolition of private property is necessary and not simply pressure on individual companies. Now, the third reason socialists believe in the abolition of private property, according to Hayward, is that it creates conflict. And it does this in two ways. So firstly, inequality is a necessary and growing feature of capitalism, and it leads to resentment, which leads in turn to conflict. Let me just explain this a little bit. So, growing inequality is seen as an inevitable feature of capitalism, according to Marxists, because, think about it, those born rich are able to increase their wealth faster than those born without wealth simply by investing it. Yeah, if you're born very rich, you just put your money in the bank and just the interest will pile up. You don't have to work, you don't have to do anything. Those born poor, however, will on average, however hard they work and however talented they are, never be able to reach the income levels obtained by the rich. And the poorer the country and the family they're born into, the less education they'll be able to afford, and therefore the less likely they will ever be able to get into the position of getting a well-paid job. There's sometimes said that under capitalism, the rich get richer whilst the poor get poorer. And I'll show you some statistics later on to show that that is indeed true. But whether or not people believe that the poor always get poorer, that is open to debate. What is clear, though, is that even if the poor get richer, they do so at a slower rate than the rich. And therefore, inequality is always increasing. Yeah. So we can see this in the current statistics on inequality in today's world. A 2016 report by Oxfam, for example, showed that the world's 62 richest people owned more wealth than the poorest 3.5 billion people. Yeah, and the poorest 50% of the world's population. So that's quite staggering inequality, isn't it? Just 62 people, yeah, people you could fit in our classroom, own more than half the population of the planet. The following year, though, 2017, Oxfam published a report saying just the world's 8 richest people owned more than the world's poorest 3.5 billion people, bottom 50% of the planet. So that's people that could fit very comfortably in bloody H5A, owning more than the poorest 50% of the population. I'll give you some other figures as well. Oxfam showed that the wealth of the poorest 50% of the planet actually dropped by 41% between 2010 and 2015. So the poor are indeed getting poorer, whilst the wealth of those richest 62 people increased by $500 billion. Their report also noted that the wealthiest 1% of the global population owned more than the other 99% put together. So this is incredible, staggering inequality, far higher levels of inequality than when Marx was writing, but this is precisely what Marx predicted, is this inequality was a necessary and growing feature of capitalism. Even in the UK, if we just look at just one country, the UK, which has a fairly developed welfare state and a relatively high level of tax, 45% on those with the biggest incomes. Even in this country, those conditions, the country's 13 richest people own more wealth than the poorest 13 million. So these levels of inequality, argue socialists, lead to resentment. Those at the bottom, stuck on low wages, no matter how hard they work, become resentful at those with far more than they could ever hope to get, especially if those people at the top had not actually worked for it. Now this resentment gets exacerbated, you could argue, by the advertising industry, which constantly pushes the message that your worth as a human being depends on your ability to consume certain products, certain clothes, trainers, cars, etc. And criminality and social conflict, you can easily see, might be the result of a system that tells people they need certain things but doesn't allow them to afford those things. You can easily see how crime might result from that. However, there's also a deeper reason why capitalism drives conflict. And this is because capitalism is racked by inherent contradictions which lead to ever worsening overproduction crises. I'm going to explain what this means, but I would say note down that phrase. All right? Socialists believe capitalism is racked by inherent contradictions which lead to ever worsening overproduction crises. Okay? What this means, let me explain it. The basic drive of capitalism is to maximize profits. Just pause the video here. Think, what I'm going to tell you, they can do this in 2 basic ways. Pause the video, think what are the basic ways that a company could maximize its profits. Okay, the 2 basic ways a capitalist can maximize his profit is by selling more of his goods or by reducing his costs. They're the 2 basic ways. Sell more or, cut your costs. The major cost for any company is, pause the video here again and have a think. What do you think is the biggest cost for any company, generally speaking? The major cost for any company generally is its wage bill. So the most effective way to reduce costs is to reduce wages, either by replacing people with machines, that is technological improvement, or by simply paying people less. So capitalism will do both of these as best it can. It will pay its workforce as little as possible, and when they start organising into trade unions and demanding better pay, it will often close down factories there and go somewhere else, some other country where wages are cheaper. This has been happening across the Western world, for example, for the past 40 years, with more and more companies closing down their factories and mines and so on in Europe and America, where wages are high, and relocating them to third world countries like China, where wages are lower. At the same time, technological improvement has meant that far fewer workers are now needed each year to produce the same amount of goods. And the development of artificial intelligence actually promises to make the majority of the world's population redundant over the coming decades. But this cost-cutting creates a problem for capitalism, because ultimately the very workers who are being made redundant or whose wages are being cut are the same people capitalism relies on to buy its goods. Yep. So ultimately more and more goods are being produced, but with fewer and fewer people able to actually afford them. And this is what is termed an overproduction crisis. With goods piling up unsold, what happens is factories are then forced to close down, and even more redundancies ensue, even fewer people are able to buy products, and you get a vicious cycle. The classic example of this was the Great Depression of the 1930s, beginning with the Wall Street crash in 1929. But you had other examples as well in the 1870s. You had an earlier Great Depression as well, beginning in 1873. And you've had smaller examples of this as well, these kind of crises as well throughout the whole existence of capitalism. Engels used to relate a story to show the absurdity of overproduction crisis. No need to write this down, but just listen. It's a good example of how socialists characterize the absurdity of capitalism. So in this story, a boy who is the son of a coal miner comes home and he finds that his house is freezing cold. So he asks his mother, he says, "Mama, why is the house so cold?" And she says, "Oh, because we've got no money for coal for the fire." He says, "Oh, why have we got no money for coal?" He says, "Oh, because your father, who's a coal miner, don't forget, lost his job, so we can't afford it." "Oh, why did he lose his job?" "Because there's too much coal." Yeah. So this is the ultimate absurdity of capitalism for Marx and Engels. And they summarize the situation in this quote from the Communist Manifesto. They say, a very good quote, write it down if you want, it's quite long, you don't have to, but it's a nice one. "In these crises there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry and too much commerce." They say this is just hard. Someone from an earlier time would just find this unfathomable, just impossible to understand, that people are starving, people are dying, people are impoverished because there's too much being produced. It's hard to understand. And we can see the same brutal absurdity at work today in the farming industry. So again, you don't write down this, but I just want to really kind of get across this idea of absurdity and irrationality that socialists see in capitalism. So today, for example, millions of peasant farmers around the world are being put out of work because they're unable to compete with the amazing machinery of the giant agricultural corporations. Yep, so you can see in Argentina and so on, you can see the footage of these giant soybean plantations, for example, that go on for miles and miles as far as the eye can see, that are sprayed by the air, literally by planes flying over and so on. The technology is amazing that you only need a handful of workers to farm these massive, massive millions of acres of land, these giant plantations. Obviously, all the peasant farmers who used to live there have all been thrown off the land, or neighbouring farmers are unable to compete with the low prices and so on. So farmers all around the world in their millions are being forced to leave the land and seek work in the cities. They can't make a living as farmers anymore because the agricultural technology is too good for them to compete with, right? So they go to the cities, but there's not enough work there either. So they end up living in these slums, these shanty towns that are now on the edges of all of the major cities pretty much in the third world. Slum cities of cardboard shacks lacking electricity, running water and so on, where they're vulnerable to exploitation, disease, malnutrition. And today 1/3 of city dwellers in the world live in slums like these. Now 25,000 people starve to death every day on this planet. That's 9 million per year, equivalent to one Holocaust every 8 months, if you want to put it in those terms. And many of them do so because there's too much food being produced. Yet they're starving to death because too much food is being produced, because food production technology is so advanced. Yeah, this is putting them out of work, meaning they can't earn a wage, meaning they're starving to death. Do you see the absurdity? People are starving to death because there's too much food. So this is capitalism. And remember, socialism is an enlightenment ideology. So socialists believe in rationalism. They believe in the rational organization of production to meet human needs. And they believe the capitalist system is deeply irrational because production for profit precludes production for social needs. So these contradictions within capitalism lead to conflict. They lead to a growing divide between the capitalist class and the proletarian class, and they create the conditions so terrible for the proletariat that the proletariat is effectively forced to rebel against the system simply to survive. So in the 20th century, for example, we've seen socialist revolutions, and if you know some of them, pause the video here and just think how many countries you can think of that have had socialist revolutions in the 20th century. So first and most famously was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, led by Lenin. Then you had the Chinese Revolution in 1949, led by Mao Zedong. The Korean Revolution in North Korea happening around the same time. 10 years later, in 1959, you had the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Then in the 60s and 70s, you had socialist revolutions coming to power in Vietnam, Angola, Mozambique, Burkina Faso, amongst others. Now, these were all in the third world, you will have noticed, in the global south, which makes sense from a Marxist point of view because this is where people are the most heavily exploited, where the situation is the most desperate. So, to summarize this point so far, capitalism leads to ever worsening economic crises in which the masses of the people pay the heaviest price. These crises lead to ever more miserable conditions for the proletariat, and this leads to social conflict and ultimately revolution. But there's also an even more drastic way in which economic crisis leads to conflict. And this is because capitalist states always seek to displace the worst effects of the crisis onto other countries as far as possible. So in the 1870s, for example, European countries responded to the economic crisis of that period with what became known as the Scramble for Africa. It was an intense period of European colonization of the African continent, in which Britain, France, Germany and Belgium divided up the whole continent amongst themselves. Britain and France, of course, had already colonized much of Asia, and this meant they were able to deal with their overproduction crisis by exporting steel to build railways in their colonies. Yeah? Germany, however, which developed as a modern state much later than France and Britain, was not able to deal with its own overproduction of steel in this way. So instead it put its surplus steel into building up its army and navy in order to fight Britain and France and take their colonies from them. This is the Marxist analysis of the causes of the First World War. It's an attempt by Germany to break out of its overproduction crisis by defeating Britain and France and taking their colonies from them in order to win captive export markets for its goods. The attempt failed, but the Great Depression of the 30s led to the rise of the Nazis, who tried again. And ultimately the destruction caused by the Second World War was so intense, 78 million people killed, huge, millions of acres of Europe just turned into rubble, that solved the overproduction crisis by basically laying waste to most of Europe. So this paved the way for a new round of productive and profitable investment. However, overproduction set in once again in the 1970s as the post-war boom came to an end. Since then, capitalism has embarked on a new round of wage cutting, relocation of industry to low-wage economies, and privatization, an attempt to open up formerly publicly owned industries to private investment. But that has again ultimately exacerbated the problem, as it meant, again, people have less money to spend. So what's happened since then is that governments have lifted restrictions on bank lending so that people can be lent, so that banks can lend money to people so they can keep consuming products that they can't really afford. But then all this came to a head in 2008 as it became clear banks were lending money to people who would never be able to afford to pay them back, and the whole banking system stood on the verge of collapse. It was only prevented from collapse by governments stepping in to bail them out. So since then, people's personal debts have continued to grow, but now governments are hugely indebted as well because they paid this huge amount of money for the bailout. So economists agree that another devastating crash is highly likely. And then you have leaders such as Trump who are set on making sure that other weaker countries pay the price as far as possible. So many Marxists then believe that all the conditions are ripe for another Great Depression followed by another World War. In summary then, socialists are opposed to capitalism and opposed to private property for moral, spiritual, and economic reasons. Moral, because it is unjust and exploitative system. Spiritual, because private property and capitalism brings out the worst elements of human nature and suppresses the best. And economic, because it's economically contradictory and leads to conflict, social unrest, and ultimately war.